Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Flying podcast. I'm again joined by Swithun Dobson, Keith Preston, Terminal Philosophy. We're here to discuss the broader crisis in education, which the most thing that people are talking about today is the shortage of teachers. So, one of the things we've seen is a rash of teachers quitting throughout the Anglosphere, Canada, Australia, Great Britain, United States. And it's getting to the point where they're actually really struggling to find replacement teachers. Now, one of the, there's a lot of problems that the teachers are self-reporting on. One of them is, in addition to teaching, there's all these other things that they have to do. There's a lot of this extracurricular politicking where you meet with other teachers, you meet with administration. That all eats into your time. They talk about the classes are too big. They talk about the fact that parents sort of expect the parents sort of expect the teachers to be parents instead of them, which of course the teacher's not really qualified to do that, nor is able to do that. They also get into fights over how the curriculum is taught. Like certainly right now with the transgender stuff, there's been a lot of parents that have been, and also before that with the COVID vaccine stuff, there were a lot of parents that were mad with the teachers and the school and the education that they were getting, which was adding a lot of headaches to it. There's a shortage of properly accredited teachers, and so there's a lot there. But one of the things is I want to speak to the lack of properly accredited teachers. A lot of this is just BS. So when I went to college, one of the things that I wanted to do was to teach history. There's now, okay, if you go back to the Middle Ages and you join a guild, there was basically a path to master. You go from an apprentice to a journeyman to a master, and if you went through all the steps, you'd get to be a master. Like that was just how it was. That doesn't mean there wasn't politics, there wasn't stuff you had to deal with, but there was a path to success. When I went to college, there was no path. Nobody was telling me, and presumably other people that didn't get jobs in the educational choices that they were studying. Nobody told us, okay, well, if you want to be a teacher, you need to get a master's degree, you need to do all this other stuff. We didn't know. I mean, and so we just kind of got flushed out. So there's that. They just don't tell the students what they have to do to be a teacher. They kind of keep you in the dark on purpose. And then two, they fight you. So like a lot of talented people aren't going to play the political game. And so they just get flushed out. And so of course you're going to have a shortage of qualified people because the people that are quote unquote qualified aren't, because they just won, the high school popularity contest. And the really qualified people got flushed out. And then on top of that, when I was in college, one of the things the professors always complained about was the sort of political dictates from on high. Now, this wasn't a state college. This was a affiliated church college with the Quakers, the Friends. But the point is, though, they had all of this political crap coming down from the president, from the board of directors, that they were saying like they have no idea what it's like for us at this level of teaching, and they're just throwing all this FUD at us to deal with. And plus, they didn't get along with each other. So, there's that too. So there's that problem. And then there's the fact that, the modern day top down, at this point, almost everybody's admitted that Common Core is a total failure. So whoever the genius was that came up with Common Core and shoved it on the school systems, I mean, that just completely blew up in people's faces. And so there's all of this like political crap that you have to deal with as a teacher, the new whatever the board of directors, whether this is true for parochial schools as well as public schools, because again, Malone was a parochial school that I went to. And the other thing was, when you look at the teachers, they're frankly just not that good. They're really just not that good. My experience with teachers were, when I was in private school for very early on, it was a private Christian school up until third grade. I mean, it was kind of meh. I didn't really know I was too little to have an opinion on it, but it wasn't anything, spectacular. And in college, it was terrible. So, but the reason why teachers are terrible is because they're not there because they're good teachers. They're there because the path to success is political. And it's the same in parochial schools as well as public schools. And all you have to do is just play the right political game and you're in. You're basically guaranteed to get in. And so then the real issue is, Well, how did that happen? How do we fix that? Because there's they throw all these hurdles at you to be accredited. So, to be properly accredited, to be able to teach at this institution, you have to do X, Y, and Z. And it's like, well, you didn't tell any of us this. And a lot of it's completely irrelevant to what we actually have to study. So, for example, one of the things that Ivan Illich pointed out in his discussions on education is, why is it that somebody who's going to become a history professor, say teaching, ancient Greek at a college or university level, have to know anything about mathematics? Why are all of these knowledge sets lumped together, that if you can't pass all of them, you somehow fail scholastically, and then you can't get to the specialized field that you were setting up for? And he makes a really good point. That's ridiculous. Why should they all be lumped together? They shouldn't, but by lumping it all together, you create more filters that wash out people that are really good at the specialized niche area that they're at, but they're not allowed to advance because they're not successful at other disciplines that are completely unrelated to what they're going to teach. So, like, for example, if you're going to teach about ancient Greece, what do you need to know about statistics? Unless you're going to do like a study of like Greek economic consumption in like the 5th century, in which case you might. You don't really need that. So there's a whole lot to unpack here. So I'll hand it off to you, Swithun, with the school crisis, teacher crisis.
The current crisis is merely a symptom of essentially, well, I mean, in the UK's case, I'd say probably 1870, but more obviously since 1945, and probably more so from the 1960s. But to put it into more recent context to begin with, you're having what's happened in the UK is during lockdowns of 2020 and also 2021. So the schools were closed for the first 3 months in March to June 2020, and then they were closed essentially from January 2021 to around March, April 2021. So about 6 months. During that time, because they'd terrified parents, particularly mothers, about how dangerous coronavirus was, which is not a lie, to their children, so they didn't send them back. But more positively, in certain respects, parents realized that their kids were happier and that they seemed to be more well-adjusted than they were when they were in school. And so a lot of them then decided just to take them out of school and educate them at home from like September 2020. And so you're having falling numbers of that, because essentially, they were forced to home educate in a sense. Now, obviously, that didn't bear much resemblance to anything you would normally have done at home educating, because kind of stuff is open when you home educate. Normally, not everything's closed, and you can leave your house despite it being called home education. You have to do it all in the house, for instance. So this has then caused a big fall in numbers, and this has then been used as a pretext for the UK government to try to pass the current schools bill, which is essentially a way of making it very difficult for parents to choose where their child goes, or more so, and tightening up any other loopholes to try and have any sort of genuine competition to the state sector or the regulated private sector. That's clearly what the purpose of this act is. But this has been in the works for many years. As ever, this isn't a case. It's not like, oh no, global pandemic. We have to have the Great Reset. That's the only possible solution. It's like, no. This was planned many years in advance, and now it's just time to spring the plan. So it is going down, and to school in general. I mean, it isn't surprising that people don't want to continue. I'm a private tutor. I went into teaching. I didn't really want to do it, and the reasons I didn't like it, I expected to be the reasons I didn't like it. I mean, so in the schooling system, I mean, I was predominantly 16 to 18, although you have more specialization. one benefit of the UK system relative to the American system is it does specialize earlier, and you can specialize earlier. But effectively, people just do it because go to the schools in 16 to 18, even though you don't technically have to. They did change it. The school leaving age was 16 until recently. It's effectively 18 now. Basically because, well, everyone does it and employers expect you to do it. You know, they have actual no interest in doing it, and especially at the lower, sort of high school level. Especially teen boys have zero interest in being there. And so it's unsurprising teachers don't really want to be there themselves because they have a dual role, which is entertainer and prison warder, because that's effectively all they're doing. So it's unsurprising that they aren't really learning anything of interest because they don't see any point in being there. You mentioned the sort of the guild system. I mean, most of these people learn best in the environment in which they will actually use the skills that they are learning, because they'll actually see a point in using them. If you're stuck in a classroom and this is going to bear no resemblance to anything you want to do in the future, what's the point of me being there? There isn't. And they know there's no point being there, but legally they have to be there. I think now, I think historically children were disciplined more, and so they were kind of like regulated through the system. And I think that's to some extent broken down, as you mentioned before. Parents have offload a lot of parental stuff onto the schools. This is slightly different, but there was a police drama a number of years ago, Line of Duty, the first series, and there's a character there with a son who's into he basically was a drugs mule for a gang. And he's having a meeting or something with the police, and he's a responsible adult there. And she responds, "Isn't that what social workers for?" That's not her role. She's not the responsible adult. That's a social worker's role, which is the same thing as the way the school system was. And I mean, the school system makes no sense because ostensibly it comes from genuine academic backgrounds where you went there because you wanted to go into academic roles which required high levels of education, so traditionally the priesthood, law, other things like that. And then it was hijacked by big business to be free training, and this is what basically happened in 1870 in England. And then probably after the Second World War, and you kept getting more people in there, it then became sort of daycare. And so you have these three completely opposed purposes of the system. It isn't entirely surprising that it doesn't work very well.
Right. Keith?
Well, it's interesting because in my own experience, I've been in and around educational institutions for my entire life. In the lower grades, I went to a private church-run school similar to what Todd was describing, and then I went to regular public school in the higher grades. And then in college level, I went to a community college and to a state university, and I've also taught in colleges, in community colleges and state universities and private colleges. And based on all these experiences, my opinion of the whole educational system is pretty low at every level. There's not really any level where I would give educational institutions very high marks. And I think, though, that one of the problems we see today, I think one of the main problems is that there are too many people in schools and colleges at every level that just shouldn't be there. And that applies to both faculty and students. For example, we had this incident recently with school shootings, and that's an issue here in the States. Most of the people who do the school shootings in earlier generations would not have been in school at the age that they were. Like usually, like say in my parents' generation, which is like in 1940s, 1950s, somebody who was say 18 years old and a psychopath probably would have quit school at age 15 or so. I mean, they would have quit school before they were old enough to go and do a shooting. So now maybe they would have done a shooting somewhere else, and maybe they would have been a criminal or something and been a robber. But you didn't really have public school shootings or school shootings back then, I think in part because all the troublemakers had quit school or gotten expelled by the time they were old enough to really pull off something like that. Also, we were talking about teachers, nobody really wanting to be a teacher. One problem is that, one issue we hear from the left a lot is that teachers don't get paid enough. And I think that's true in some places, but not in others. Like, depends on the jurisdiction. In the United States, if you teach in one of the large city public school systems where it's unionized and all of that, that's a cushy job. If you're teaching in some rural public school system, yeah, you're probably going to be underpaid. But I also think that competence on the part of teachers is a problem. And one of the lines of work that I'm in, one of the things that I do is I review curriculum for university classes. And one thing that I've noticed is that a lot of the curriculum that's being given to university students that are majoring in education, or just education is their degree, and sometimes there's specializations like elementary education and that kind of stuff. Those kinds of degrees are considered the low end when it comes to college education. Like, if you have a degree in education, that's just considered a lowbrow degree. It's like having a degree in gender theory or something like that. And a lot of the curriculum that's taught at that level for those kinds of courses is high school level material. And a lot of the students in those fields, whom I've personally encountered, a lot of them basically have high school, if not middle school level education themselves. So we have people who are really seriously incompetent teaching in the public school system and in just the K through 12 system generally. Well, we've got incompetent people at the universities too, but that's a somewhat separate story. I have seen instructions, for example, that school teachers in K through 12 have written where they're not writing in complete sentences. They're giving their students assignments and information about the course or the papers they're supposed to be writing or something, and the teachers cannot spell. The teachers cannot write in complete sentences. They cannot write in a way that uses appropriate paragraphs or punctuation. And some of them, I've seen planning schedules that teachers have written up before, and they're just totally incompetent. It's like they don't even know how to use a calendar. And so we have a lot of people teaching, at least in the United States, we have people teaching in schools that really have no business teaching because they're not educated themselves. I think one thing that we have a problem with in the American system is that teachers are frequently not expected to have education in the field in which they are actually teaching. For instance, if you get a degree in education, that means you can basically teach, at least in the lower grades or even high school in some places, just in that field. You have an education degree. Okay, we'll give you a job teaching high school English. Well, maybe you don't know the first thing about grammar structure or anything like that, but as long as you have that education degree, it qualifies you. When I was in high school, we had guys teaching history and science classes that were football coaches. Their grades, their degree was in something like physical education. Like their degree was in sports or something. And they were teaching science and history and fairly involved disciplines. So I've seen a lot of that. I have seen people who use atrocious grammar just in their personal conversation teaching English. Who can't really speak in a way that involves proper grammar. And I've seen this at every level. I remember in elementary school, I had a teacher once who was always saying, I'm going to learn you how to do these things. Even I, like age 8 or whatever I was, knew that was not proper grammar. That, you don't say, I'm going to learn you how to, do math or something like that. Now she was very old. So, maybe, that wasn't as big of a deal when she was coming up. But I've seen this for 50 years now at every level. You have people teaching who are not qualified to teach, who don't know the subject matter they're teaching. Even at the university level, I've seen people teaching who were absolutely incompetent. I had an undergrad math class once where the TA, the professor's TA, was a senior. He wasn't even a grad student. He was a senior because this was a lower level class, a 100 level class. And the professor was so incompetent, he just turned over the class to his TA. So he basically had a college senior teaching a class, teaching a freshman level class. and that kind of thing's not that uncommon, not as uncommon as people think anyway. And of course, the students are no prize either. Like Swithun was talking about how we're farming out all these responsibilities, these parental responsibilities to schools. I remember when I was in elementary school in the 70s, the kids who went to daycare, like you had some kids that always came early and they were there for daycare before school, and then they were there for daycare after school. They didn't go home until 7 o'clock in the evening. Those were always the kids that were troublemakers, that their parents were divorced, or they didn't have a stable place to live. They were being tossed around from foster family to grandparents to, and these were all the screwed up kids basically. And now most kids are like that, so it's, all these things I think converge to make the educational system what it is. Todd showed me a video earlier today about a teacher in Gwinnett County, which is in the Atlanta area in Georgia. He was talking about school discipline. Now I'm not a big disciplinarian type. I wouldn't be a good anarchist if I was. But you see in schools today, I teach university students, and I see this at the university level. I see university students who come to class 20 minutes late and leave 20 minutes early. They come to class wearing literally their pajamas. I see students who literally come to class and sleep throughout the class period. I've seen students on the cell phone texting and all that constantly during classes. I've seen students with laptops out, watching videos or porn or whatever. And this is all the time. This is not just an occasional thing that's happened or some oddity. I mean, this is normal. This is just what students do, particularly with all the online schooling we have nowadays. A lot of students just don't think those are real classes, so they don't take them seriously. They don't do any work, and then they wonder why they failed. I think that it's probably even worse with K through 12 students, because we have young people like that, like 12-year-olds or younger. I can't imagine when I was 12 or 10 or 8 or something like that. I can't imagine what it would have been like. We didn't have computers back then, but if somebody had sat me in front of a computer at home during the day and said, "Okay, this is school. Pay attention. Learn how to divide your fractions or whatever," I would have like, forget this. I'm going to watch a Star Trek rerun. And that seems to be where we are.
All right, terminal philosophy.
All right. Well, this is somewhat of a frightening issue that's going on lately across the Anglosphere. Just from researching this subject just a little bit, it seems like, and we've all touched on this for the most part, but the various issues facing teachers and the public education system in general are something like, the classroom sizes are too large. And one thing that I think has maybe perhaps not quite been touched on directly is that there's a general declining quality of K through 12 curriculum, by which I mean there is quite a bit less a focus on literature and stories, history, and especially geography. And I'll come back to that in a minute. And then I will say that, there is also a bad disconnect between the administration and teachers. Many teachers, and now again, this just sort of depends on, their location in the country or their just where they're at. But many teachers are simply run into the ground with the amount of extracurricular responsibilities that they are in charge of. Keith mentioned earlier that, some of the teachers he's known, are like PE teachers, but they end up teaching literature or English. And I had a very similar situation in my high school here in Utah. And then, there's also Keith's point earlier about there being too many people in general, at least at the university. And I'll speak to that here in a moment as well. And then also, just anecdotally speaking, I do have several family members and closer friends who have taught public education, and some of them still teach, and all of whom have different political leanings, social backgrounds, and practically all of them, at least I would feel comfortable in this setting speaking on their behalf, they would agree that society is basically just demanding a bit too much of teachers in general, specifically in the sense that we've made them sort of partially responsible for raising young people. Now, Todd and I have spoke about one of these points in private conversation, and that's the declining quality of public education curriculum. Is a bit of a weird tangent, and I brought it up with Swithun before as well. But there's kind of a hokey TV show that I watch occasionally that's about it is based off of Agatha Christie's murder mystery novels called Poirot, the Belgian French-speaking detective. And the setting of that is basically around the turn of the century, I think it's actually set in the interwar period. And well, the reason why I'm bringing this up is that Poirot and his British accomplice, or his assistant detective, I think his name is Hastings, even in sort of the lower class slum class of London, the people that they typically run into, even a lot of these poorer, downtrodden people are able to at least, quote Shakespeare, or they speak proper English, they have proper grammar, so on and so forth. And I wanted to see if there was any sort of historical sort of justification for that. And in A History of Great Britain, I apologize, I can't remember the name of the author. I'll see if I can find it here in just a moment. But when you look at the curriculum that was taught around the turn of the century till about the mid-1940s, early 1950s, there was quite a bit more emphasis placed on even just, for really young children, things like just storytelling. And then as they get a bit older, a little more like heavier focus on literature and geography and things like that. I will say anecdotally that friends from my generation, I'm in my early 30s, so my friends that are anywhere from there in the early 30s to late to mid 20s, hardly anyone knows a damn thing about geography, and it's pretty. I mean, it's kind of flabbergasting how bad people's sense of geography is. And then I think one other thing I'll say too is that particularly in urban areas, and again, this is not necessarily true across the board, but certainly in urban areas, school teachers are subjected to extreme levels of disrespect. My sister at one point, she was teaching German and English in an urban public school in Michigan. And it's just extreme levels of disrespect and insubordination that teachers have to put up with. And it doesn't necessarily matter if your teaching style is highly disciplinarian or if it's more passive and just focus on the subject at hand. There's obviously something wrong at the home with a lot of where these children are from, that there's just no respect for teachers. There's no respect or, not much emphasis on the importance of education in general. So, and then of course, there's the more recent development of curriculum that's becoming, so-called, it's becoming more woke as time goes on. And I think, I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest the apparent failure of things like Common Core and things like that. I mean, just like bizarre sociological experiments that have taken place in public education. So like with many issues in the humanities, it's not just one problem going on. It's the combined effects of multiple factors at once. And also the last thing I'll say too is that classroom sizes have increased to, somewhere in like the low 30s to the low 40s, depending on the location in the country, at least here in the United States. It's hard for me to speak on anything in Great Britain or elsewhere in the West. But so it's basically like teachers are being pulled from about 6 or 7 different directions as if they are on some sort of like medieval torture rack or, stretching board or something like that. So I'll leave my initial comments at that.
Yeah, one of the points that's been brought up currently is that the lower, so like K through 12, has completely failed as education. There's the famous 8th grade Kansas 1895 high school exam, which is really difficult. I could pass the history, that was about it. But the thing is, you look at just how part of it's due to grade inflation. And part of that's due to the fact that we don't want certain groups of people who we all know who they are to not fail classes, but they do. And in order to prevent that from happening, we just do grade inflation. And well, one group that we can name are the jocks. I remember at school, because college, where all the money was coming from the jocks, they weren't doing great at the academic stuff. So there was grading on a curve, and it's like, you're not going to let so and so fail because he's bringing a lot of money to the school because of his performance on the team. And so we will see that with them. Also, what seems to have happened in American education right around 1945 is, prior to that, because America, founded itself as a republic, it was rooted in the liberal arts education, right? So with the liberal arts education, that's how you have a citizen body able to engage in politics and in the affairs of state. That's how everybody who wanted a republican form of government organized education since ancient Greece. And so, they had special focus on history, literature, philosophy, and also religious instruction, because the United States was predominantly Christian at the time. But so all of that between like 1945 and like the 60s gets phased out in favor of STEM, because now we have all of the universities become engines for research and development. And so now you want to prioritize kids getting into STEM, but even now we're seeing that they fail to get the minimum education in mathematics and science and whatnot to even do STEM effectively. But one of the things that we see is that when you what happens if you have the classic liberal arts education is you create a consensus. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody agrees on what matters of like truth or beauty are or anything like that. And that's why we have these quote unquote debates within the tradition. So you got Plato versus Aristotle. You've got the Trojans versus the Greeks, and it depends on depending on who's writing the poem or the story, one or the other is the good guy or the bad guy. But it does create this framework of thinking about who you are and how you relate to other people that is gone. And in fact, it's gone. And the best description of this is, Harold Bloom's Closing the American Mind, or Alan Bloom's Closing the American Mind, where basically these, progressive, radical student fanatics just, issued ultimatums and threatened violence against professors in a way that was analogous to how Nazi students did it in the 30s, according to Bloom. And they just got rid of it. They just got rid of all of this stuff because they were threatened and intimidated by the students. They were allowed to. I mean, it's really incredible that this kind of intimidation and violence was tolerated. It's still tolerated today. I mean, you've got drug deals going down in schools. You've got people getting shot at schools. So it's only gotten worse since when Bloom was writing. But all this does is it just creates this vacuum that isn't being filled. Even STEM isn't filling it. So what it ends up being is, I think, as you said, terminal philosophy, these social experiments done by the controllers of the Anglosphere, and it's just a complete disaster. And what we need to see, and not only that, prior to 1945, I only think like anywhere from 5 to 10% of the American population was college/university educated, because you didn't really need to have that kind of an education unless you went into something very specific like law or history or literature or theology, in which case you would need that. But most people wouldn't need that. They could get some sort of trade job or something, or they were still living on farms. And so there are lots, but now what's happening is like you've said, Swithun, it's on the job training. The corporate world wants all of these STEM degrees so that they can, run their R&D programs, and they want the state to pay for it. And that's not working either. And so this whole mess is fundamentally, though, I think rooted in a pedagogy. Prior to 1945, we had the classic liberal arts in the United States. And then after that, it just became social engineering and STEM. Now, the social engineering element goes back to the Rockefellers. There was a 1912 paper that was published by the General Education Board, which was a Rockefeller front program to educate recently freed Negroes, sharecroppers, and they basically said that the entire point of our education program is to prevent any sort of rise of a liberal arts culture where people can be, men of letters, rhetoricians, theologians, philosophers, all of these, great minds that we see from the history of the West. But people that are just going to be lumps of clay for us to mold in our own hands. Now that was still a private initiative that the Rockefellers were funding, but as they've taken over the education system, those interests, we've seen exactly what they said would happen. And so in one respect, education isn't failing because according to the Rockefellers and people like them, they want to have docile lumps of clay they can mold in their own image. And we seem to have that, but that's not education. Swithun.
There's lots of ways to go on from here. I do think that there has definitely been a pedagogical change with progressive education from the early 20th century, although I don't think that itself, I think even if you were not to have that, I don't know how many people would be men of letters and liberal arts educated to any particular degree. I just think historically the only people who were trained to a reasonable level were the people who were able to do so because they were a higher class or more and more intelligence, etc. And so I don't think you would see a massive change there. And also with the general culture, because it was some limited media wise, it was easier to have more of a cohesive sort of culture based on particular works, whereas now that's slightly less. That's somewhat more difficult with alternatives and rise of mass television and film, etc. So I don't think you can go back in that respect. I would say, if I was going to say what the major problem is with the schooling system, is really that actually step back. You mentioned that the whole university system is set out to sort of train R&D people. The thing is, if you ask graduate employers, like barely any of them say that anybody's ready to work. In the corporate world, it's like 30 or 40%. That's it. And it's like, this is kind of the whole point, is that they train us, then they can come and work for you. And it's like, but you don't think they're any good. It's like, why don't you spend your own money to train people? I think fundamentally the problem is that nobody really has an idea of what the point of education is, and also doesn't recognize that certain people simply can't be educated in any academic field to a particularly large degree because they have neither the aptitude nor the inclination to do so. Then libertarian hat, child labor laws, etc. Just kick them out, get me a job. I mean, they'd be much better there. They'd learn stuff and actually become very useful. I watch lots of cookery programs, which you may guess from the size of me. And a lot of them on there, they say they hated school, they were useless. And then they went and started cooking in a commercial kitchen. They started pot washing stuff. And then and the thing is, you talk to these people, they don't seem that stupid. I mean, they're probably not academic, but the skilled manual kind of workers, and they do something meaningful with their lives. But obviously this kind of thing is stopped off, and then there's a whole rabbit hole of stuff there with things like insurance contracts and not being able to contractually waive liability and stuff, and it goes to the courts. So there's a whole rabbit hole of stuff you could go with there. So that would be, I would say, is the main problems. On to STEM. STEM is ridiculous, the way they push it. The funniest thing they do, though, with STEM in England, I don't know if they do it in America, is women in STEM, because we don't have enough women in science, technology, engineering, and maths. Now, I probably wouldn't have heard from my female tutees if they liked it, but every single one has, if they've mentioned it, have mentioned it with complete derision. That they just keep promoting themselves. Like, we don't care. Like, one of them is even doing maths as well. It's like, why do you keep promoting? I don't care. And it's going increasingly that way with curriculum changes. I mean, the gender pay gap is now, and ethnic pay gap is on the A-level economics syllabus. So that's entertaining. I don't think many people give the explanations I do for those things, and I do probably tell them not to write them in their exam. Cold winter's hypothesis, probably not going to go down well with many of the examiners, but it's definitely good. And lastly, TP was saying about geography. Geography is bad in England. Is seriously bad. Nobody knows where anything is. Geography has basically turned into like rubbish economics. That is essentially, and some like quasi like low level geology. That is essentially what geography has become. It's like it's almost like in a way also the Marxists ended up leaving economics being anthropologists. It's kind of like the really sort of social democrat types of left the economics field because they can think that's a bit stupid. You go to geography instead. So geography is a weird subject, and nobody knows what anything is.
Yeah, well. Before I give it to you, Keith, the reason why they're pushing women into STEM is the race to the bottom. They want to lower the cost of STEM technicians in order to make it cheap, because the whole system is based on not paying these highly educated, competent technicians what they're worth, because they want to, and you can do that by flooding the market so that you can have pick of the litter. And as far as the anthropology you brought up, yeah, that's happened to history too. You have these like failed third-rate anthropologists that took over history. We actually did a video on history about a few months ago where I made this complaint, so I won't bring it up again in too much detail here. But yeah, they just like anthropology, crap all over, and it's like, dude, this is just a third-rate anthropology you're bringing up to debunk something that happened. I don't know, in the Caesar's conquest of Britain. It's ridiculous. Keith.
Well, I could approach this from a lot of different angles. As far as students not knowing anything, I posted a series of videos on my personal Facebook page recently. And these are just person in the street interviews where some guy is going around asking all these young people who look to be relatively college aged, just very basic questions that they have no clue about, like asking questions like, what does YES spell? And they're like, geez, I don't know, or asking how many states. I mean, these are Americans. They're asking how many states are in the United States, or asking what Barack Obama's first name was. Or, just say, what was Obama's first name? I don't know, Joe. I mean, things that anybody who watches TV or ever went to elementary school or something should know. So, and the thing is, if I would see these videos, I've seen a lot of these kinds of videos, and if I would be inclined to disbelieve them. I would be inclined to think they're not real, that they're just made up, if I didn't personally know people like this. I may have given this example on one of our programs before, but a few years ago, it was July the 4th, and someone I know texted me saying, look, I know you're a professor, so answer me this question. What was the country that America separated from? Because this person was saying they had a friend who thought July 4th was just a party day. It was just a day to eat hot dogs and go to the beach and drink beer. And they didn't understand it had any more deeper meaning than that. It was just like Saturday or something. And this other person was like, no, it's the day America separated from another country, but she couldn't remember which country it was. And she said that she asked her mother, and her mother thought it was Germany. And I'm like, no. I said July the 4th is Independence Day, and America originally separated from England. And she said, yeah, I think I remember that from school. And then she said, so does that mean that if we hadn't done that we'd have a king and queen instead of this dumbass Trump? And I'm like, well, no, actually, England today, while they still formally have a monarchy, it's really a parliamentary state, like most modern countries. And of course, she had no clue as to what that meant. But yeah. And so, I mean, like I said, I know people like this in real life, so it's real. Now, this is a person that only has, I think, a GED level education. But I encounter university students like this. One of the things, I teach sociology classes, and for those who don't know anything about sociology, one of the major paradigms in sociology is the thought of Max Weber, and he had this theory about the reason why the Industrial Revolution developed in certain countries rather than others had to do with the influence of Protestantism. So whenever I teach the unit on Weber, and this is repeated itself dozens of times. I've had this experience dozens of times. Whenever I teach the unit on Weber, I first have to explain what a Protestant is, because I will say, okay, how many of you are Protestants? Nobody in the class raises their hand. Nobody. And then, like I said, I've had, dozens of groups of students, 50, 60 people in a lecture hall. Not a one acknowledges that they're a Protestant. And then I'll say things like, well, is anyone here a Baptist? Is anyone here a Presbyterian? Is anyone here a Methodist? Oh, yeah, I'm that, So they have no clue what religion they belong to, in other words. So I'll ask students questions like, what century did the Civil War take place in? No clue. One time when I was talking about what the Protestant Reformation was, I mentioned Martin Luther, and I had a student say, well, he actually lived in the 1960s. He didn't live in the 1500s. And I'm like, no, you're thinking about Martin Luther King, the civil rights leader. I'm talking about Martin Luther, the theologian. And then I said Martin Luther King was named after Martin Luther because of he was a Protestant pastor, and the Martin Luther was the founder of Protestantism. So then the student wanted to argue, and he said, no, Martin Luther King Jr. was named after his father because he was a junior. I'm like, well, yeah, his father was named after Martin Luther as well. So I mean, this is what passes for a university student nowadays. And I come across this all the time. It's in different kinds of contexts. However, I do think, though, when it comes to university education, there's different things going on at the same time. I had a conversation once about this with Bob Weisberg. He's a writer. He's kind of I guess you could say he's a conservative, paleo-conservative leaning. He used to write for National Review, but he got fired for saying a lot of un-PC things. But he's a retired professor emeritus of political science from somewhere, I forget where, Chicago, I think. But and he and I were talking about some of this stuff, and he was saying the way the universities work today is that in the serious disciplines, they still take that pretty seriously. Like if you go to college and you major in physics or genetic research or something where you really have to know something to do the work, yeah, they still take all that pretty seriously. The technology schools and the real scientific disciplines and that kind of stuff, and the mathematical disciplines, the education there in American universities is still pretty good. And the reason why is because elites need for it to be. I mean, when you have people working for, defense contractors like Boeing designing nuclear weapons, well, you can't have morons doing that stuff. So the people who do the real, technically proficient work that the elites want done, those people really do have to be trained. But what universities do is that universities today are set up like set up like a corporation. A university, and this is the United States. It may be different in some places, but the United States universities, and this applies to private, public, state, whatever. It doesn't matter what it is. I could do a critique of the Christian evangelical universities, and they function basically like this as well. Some of the details might be different, but it's the same system. Like the way a university works is that it's basically a corporation, and your job is to sell your product, which is university degrees, to consumers. So students are customers. They're not students, they're customers. And if you're in business, you want to have as many customers as possible. So that means you admit as many people to college as possible, and it doesn't matter whether they're qualified, just so long as you don't admit so many unqualified people that your ratings go down. Like you want to maintain a certain ratings level. So if you're like a 100% admissions, then that's going to lower your rating. So if you can usually get by up to 85% admissions. Yes. So and then you encourage students to take out massive student loan debt. Get a 4-year degree, get a PhD in basket weaving or something, and take out as much student loan debt and just keep paying the university to take classes. And in reward, and then they keep jacking up the price of colleges. So to justify that, they start offering all these amenities. So now you have rock climbing in the gym, and you have swimming pools and tennis courts and all that stuff on the campus. And you have Starbucks in the dorm and all that kind of stuff, cafeteria in the back of the lab or whatever. And then that justifies the costs. So in other words, colleges and universities are just multi-million-dollar corporations, and they have these huge endowments. But at the same time, in the serious disciplines, they do have to teach something. So they take those disciplines pretty seriously. And they kind of look at it like that's where the real education is. Like I saw this when I was in graduate school. And when I was in graduate school, and I was in humanities fields, not tech fields, but even in humanities fields when I was in graduate school, I was like, this is at a whole different level. Like they're trying to do real education here. Well, at least in some disciplines they were. But undergrad was just like glorified high school. And that's really where university level education is. Most of university level education is just a glorified high school. Graduate school is where you do your real academic work, and even then, only in specialized fields. Like if you get a PhD in gender studies or something, it might as well be a degree in video game watching or something. And then K through 12 is just a prelude to this. Like prelude K through 12 functions the same way as the university system, only it's dumbed down even more. So the purpose of K through 12 is the school districts want to get as large a budget as they possibly can. That's the main goal. So they do whatever they can to maximize their budgetary income. So like the public school system where my brother's kids went to school, in their system, how much money you got for your district was dependent on how well your students did on their achievement tests. So theoretically, you're giving the school district incentive to teach some students something, because that means your funding is going to go up. But what they would do in this school system is that they would just cram, all the classes were nothing but cramming for some. It was called an SOL test, which meant standards of learning, I believe is what it's called. We used to say it meant SOL for other reasons, but what also, like I know my brother's kids would always complain about their school. It was just all we're doing is preparing for this big test. They don't have time to spend any real time on any real subjects we like or anything, because it's just all about getting to this next test, because they want as many students to pass this test as possible so their grades can go up. It's the same way in the non-state systems as well. Like in the town that I originate from, there's a very large private Christian college. It's considered the largest Christian college in the world. At least they claim it is, and they claim it's that, I think, legitimately, only because half their students are degree mill online students. So it's like a Christian evangelical version of University of Phoenix or something like that. But they do the same thing. I mean, they have. I've seen the curriculum for some of their courses, and it's basically 8th grade level education. And like their so-called theology school is basically just a glorified Sunday school class. I'm like, yeah, that's what we did in Sunday school when I was 8. It's and then they have the same kind of sports. They have a state-of-the-art gym with like a skating rink and ice hockey and skiing and all this kind of stuff. So in other words, education is a big business, and it doesn't matter whether it's public or private, religious, secular, and that kind of stuff. And all these different schools, it's basically just the same kind of thing. It's a big business. It's like there was a sociologist years ago named Ritter, who had this theory called McDonaldization. He was saying everything in the world is starting to operate on the same model as McDonald's, where it's about just getting as many customers through the line as possible, and who cares about the quality of the product or the quality of the service, because that's not what it's for. It's supposed to be cheap, not quality. Although education's not cheap or quality. So that's kind of where we are now.
All right, terminal philosophy.
All right. Well, all I can do is just to echo a lot of that. I think also there's sort of an interesting generational variable to all this. My parents, were born in the 50s, and so there is this underlying assumption, my parents, at least born, sometime in the second half of the 20th century, that you just have to send your kids to college in order to lead a successful and fulfilling life. But I think many parents, just aren't savvy to the situation. of which Keith just described, in the sense that the university has really turned into sort of this quasi corporate entity that they just want as many students in as possible. The university that I went to, was breaking all these records in the sense that it's never had more students admitted to it than it had in its entire history. And there's a dormitory and housing shortage and things like that. And I think the university system has completely lost the idea of quality over quantity, and now they're just trying to get in as many people as possible, and that way it just justifies more contracts, and it justifies the building more weird and ultimately needless buildings and things like that. And rarely do any of these large donations that are sent to universities or contracts or anything like that, are they does that typically positively impact the incomes of many professors. It typically goes to support many other various things, and so for some odd reason this has really turned into a large business, and there's all sorts of and now there's this large fad towards STEM fields and things like that. And what you had mentioned earlier, Todd, is absolutely true, in the sense that they're trying to diminish the wages of many STEM field educators so they can admit more people in. I mean, unfortunately, STEM and the humanities, it doesn't really matter which avenue you pursue in in education, at least as far as the United States goes. I'm sure this is the case throughout the West, but particularly here in the United States, it's all against the backdrop of just money making and just kind of this crappy quasi crony capitalism, and it's just and the end result is just unfortunately really dumb people, or you get just a lot of people admitted in that really shouldn't be there. I remember not wanting to go to university right after high school just because I just wanted to get out into the real world and work, and I was just more or less told I didn't have any other option but to go in. And so, I mean, while that's not necessarily a worthy sob story, it's just it's just kind of going along with this generational assumption that you're supposed to go to college. But many boomer parents, I don't think, have their ear to the ground in terms of how the university system works now. Once again, too, this is a bit more of an anecdotal thing in regards to this larger crisis of a lack of teachers. But I will say that many teachers have a lot of unfortunate horror stories of dealing with students in more urban areas. I mean, it does happen in some more suburban and rural areas, but for the most part, it is concentrated in urban school districts where they're just subjected to really disrespectful students, and there's not an ice cube's chance in hell of even getting through curriculums in one day, simply because a lot of these students just come from many broken households, and they're just, I mean, honestly, a lot of these kids are just from the ghetto, and in that culture there's just no sort of importance placed on education in general. So and then on top of that, there's a problem with paying teachers a fair wage. I will say that. A while ago, I think John Stotzel did a program on how teachers in urban areas get paid way more than teachers in urban or in rural or suburban areas. In fact, it's so high that it makes the national average of the wage of teachers incredibly high. However, that doesn't mean that teachers in these rural or suburban areas are making good money. It just means that the urban teachers get paid such a high amount that it makes the average higher. And so, while yes, teachers get summers off and things like that, I know plenty of teachers actually who have to work second jobs, at least out here in Utah. And so, I think if we want to retain good teachers, the however many there may be out there, perhaps teachers should be paid a bit more. I'm not saying they need to be, multimillionaires or anything like that. But if there's any chance to retain good teachers, then we ought to do that. And just as a closing comment here as well, with all of these problems that we've been discussing today, it seems like public education is just very similar in a particular way to the U.S. political system and police work, in the sense that the system, like when you take a big step back from it and you look at it from a bird's eye view, it's so dysfunctional and produces such bad results that a potential teacher might look at that and just decline to go into the first place. I think, Todd, you're basically one of those people, without a doubt, that there's so much going against you, not only in terms of curriculum and either pay or things that you're forced to teach that might not be things that you are that you'd want to teach children, but it just drives talent away. And I think that's true of police work. I think that's true of local politics and many other things. But it's I don't know. What do you do? It's a frustrating situation.
So what I want to end with for my final thoughts is a quotation from the General Education Board, where the Rockefellers outline their plan for what we have now. This is from the General Education Board, Occasional Papers #1, The Country School of Tomorrow. In our dreams, we have limitless resources, and people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand. The present educational conventions fade from their minds, and unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive rural folk. We shall not try to make these people or any other children into philosophers or men of learning or men of science. We have not to raise up from among them authors, editors, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen, of whom we have an ample supply. The task we set before ourselves is very simple, as well as a very beautiful one, to train these people as we find them to a perfectly ideal life, just where they are. So we will organize our children into a little community and teach them to do in a perfect way the things their fathers and mothers are doing in an imperfect way, in the homes, in the shops, and on the farm. So this is how we got there. Final thoughts, Swithun.
I would say when it comes to sort of the disciplinarian problem, it is worse than it was, but it's a product of the system. I mean, the kids, as I pointed before, don't want to be there, and they basically have to be there because of legal conventions and law codes and things. And a lot of the a lot of the stuff that the teachers get isn't necessarily their fault or the kids' fault to some extent. It's just the nature of the schooling system, which is effectively for some kids essentially a form of prison. And finally, on this is a general line that went around Britain with respect to the quality of teachers, which was this, which I'll finish with: those that can do, those that can't teach.
Right. Final thoughts, Keith.
Yeah, the disciplinary issues or behavior issues that you see in schools are interesting. And I tend to agree with Swithun that the people in the schools who cause the most problems as far as discipline just wouldn't have been in school in past generations. They would have either dropped out at an earlier age, or if they were too much of a discipline problem, they just would have been expelled. So I think that's really the issue there. I mean, it's not that there must necessarily be a serious discipline problem, but it's just that there are too many people in school who just really shouldn't be there at all. I remember some years ago having a conversation with a guy who was a gung-ho liberal Democrat. And this is somebody who actually thought Dianne Feinstein was a model political leader. So you can get where this guy's coming from. But I was talking about education, and I was saying, my frank opinion of it is that schools, shouldn't exist, and that compulsory education laws shouldn't exist. I said that I would be willing to have schools that are completely voluntary and private as terms of, attendance, and I would even be willing to compromise and have a public school system as long as attendance there was purely voluntary as well. If it came right down to it. And then he starts going into this thing, well, don't you know that that's the system they had in feudalism, and that, if we had that today, he says without mass public awareness of the kind that comes from public education, we would all still be slaves. And I said, so you think what goes on today is called mass public awareness? That's That's what we see in our society today. We see a mass of people who are aware. It's like, come on. But one thing, though, that I've noticed when I debate progressives on this kind of issue is that they are educationists to the bone. I mean, education is like their religion. I mean, it's like telling a conservative, if you tell one of them we should abolish schools, it's like telling a conservative we should abolish church. It's like, you can't do that. That's sacrilege. It's like, they're progressives, have their own quirks, but I've noticed that anti-educationism is just one thing they just can't fathom. That and being pro-guns, I think that's another thing that they seem to have real struggles with. But yeah, I think that the problem with education is just the way it's structured. It's basically structured as this kind of state bureaucracy on one hand. It's like the post office or the division of motor vehicles. It's if it's a public system, and even private education now is basically structured like a corporation. It's like a business. So that's where we are. So if you can get your education at DMV, or you can get your education at McDonald's.
Well, terminal philosophy, last words for you.
I don't think I have anything else original to add, other than I completely agree with Keith that it's things are modeled now to the point of where it's just an extension of the state bureaucracy, and things are just unfortunately run like a business, and people are, or I shouldn't say people, I think the system is more interested in making public education this sort of this winnable statistics game where, as long as they have a high amount of students admitted and they're meeting this bare minimum requirement of students passing, at an acceptable percentage in certain curriculum, then that's good enough. But there's no sort of broader analysis in terms of what makes, an educated person. I think that if I could make one major prime complaint of this whole issue is that I think the whole modern world has really lost sense of what it means to be classically educated, by which I mean, someone who's just a well-rounded individual who has, there's not this hyper fixation on something like algebra or this hyper fixation on, this new way of teaching math. It's that, you want young people to be developed into motivated, well-rounded people, meaning that, they've heard of Shakespeare. They have a good sense of geography. They have some good sense of math and probably statistics, and a good sense of history. They don't need to be the next Noam Chomsky. They just need to be well-rounded in some of these areas. But unfortunately, things are just becoming more run like a business and this sort of numbers game. So, and I think I'm afraid it'll just have to get worse before there's this, a broader hyper public interest to make things better. So I'll leave it at that.
All right. We have one super chat from Ori Samsonov. This channel is an excellent source of education for 32 shekels. Thanks. It's much appreciated. Thanks again, Swithun, Keith, and Terminal Philosophy. It's Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.